Great. So thanks so much for having us. I've met many of you before, I'm sure. I'm a professor at U of O, direct the Urbanism Next Center and co-direct Sustainable Cities Institute, and really do two areas of research, one around sustainability and urban design, which we're going to be talking about today, and another one on emerging tech and impacts on cities. Um, Kaarin and I have been working on this. This is all focused around a book, the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, and we've been working on this for a long time, and are really thrilled that the book came out last April, and really excited to be sharing this with you. The book, oh, hold on, there we go. And so the a big question here. Oh, yeah, okay. So a big kind of question around this is the really impetus of the book is like, how do you approach urban design and sustainability in urban design and projects? We end up having a whole lot of like opportunities to do this, or a whole lot of ways of doing this in architectural projects and somewhat in landscape projects. When you really get to urban design, it gets to be a much more complicated question, and without a clear, I'll say, necessarily approach. Part of the issues is that it's really a complicated issue. How do you make a place sustainable, or is a place sustainable? This varies a ton depending on things like what your climate is, politically, how things work economically, what populations are interested in. And so, here we have these really different contexts in all those dimensions. On the top is Shanghai, the middle is in Arizona, and the bottom is in Libreville and Gabon. These are really different places. So if we ask the question, is this sustainable, or how do I make this sustainable? You'd have really different answers. And what we were really interested in is trying to find a way to get your arms around that approach, that how you deal with that. Um, why is this important to do? Well, I think we all there's a lot of agreement. I'm going to guess people who are in this meeting about kind of some of the impacts of negative impacts of being unsustainable. But partly it's just to try to understand, if we want to be more sustainable, what kinds of things should we do? What is it we should be focused on? What needs to be done? How do we compare and evaluate different places, and how do we shed light on false claims, looking at all these range of different issues that kind of exist, everything from how you deal with stormwater to ecological areas to obviously transportation networks, metropolitan footprints. How do we do all these different how do we put all these different things together? There's a ton, thankfully, a ton of fantastic work that exists out in the world around sustainability and urban design. Here you can see some of the more than 1,000 different sources that we've looked at in the research leading up to this book, and in the development of the framework that I'm going to be talking about. And it ranges from all sorts of things. Obviously, a lot of things in transportation, urban ecology, urban forestry, a lot of, as I mentioned, with stormwater kind of issues, equity kind of issues. There's a ton of different work that happens in here. The problem that exists right now is that a lot of this work is completely siloed, in that the people who are working on these topics know about them, but they don't know about the neighboring topics. There's a whole lot of like jargon related around all these things. And there's also, because of all the siloing, there's very little overlap or understanding how action around one topic is really impacting or could be benefiting, right? Impacts in other topics, other topics. So the idea was to try to find a way of putting all these things together. There are some rating systems that I think are the closest to trying to put some of these things together. Here, I'm sure many of you have used some of these. LEED and or LEED for cities and communities, and also ND exists out there. Sites, which is more landscape focused, and then the next two, DGNB and BREEAM, are really deal with a broad range of issues, everything from like good governments to design kind of issues. The problems with a lot of these is that even though they are dealing with a whole lot of different topics, they rarely talk about how the pieces are integrated to each other. They're really difficult to use as design tools as well, which is one of the things that we were really interested in putting this work together. Something that could help you think about in schematic design or design development, what kinds of things you should be doing. These are great evaluation tools. So once you've done something, or you're getting close to the finish, figuring out if you're doing it well, if you're getting the outcomes you want. But they're really difficult in terms of design tools, and they're really difficult in terms of stakeholder engagement tools, right? Again, these things get really technical really quick. It would be hard to, for instance, use LEED for cities and communities in like early stakeholder meetings. So the way that we've organized this is the Sustainable Urban Design Framework that we've kind of put together, which what it does is it takes all this, tons of research that we've done in all these different areas, and a lot of interviews with people in many different disciplines that kind of boiled it down to these 5 main outcome goals that we look at in sustainability and urban design. The first is energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use. This I'm going to guess is the one that's most familiar to most people, which is just how do you get people out of cars and into bike ped transit. Water is mostly stormwater issues. When water falls from the sky, what happens to it? How does it become or not become runoff, and how do we deal with that? Ecology and habitat, really dealing with ecological networks and how we get species kind of health and robustness. Energy use and production, this is all the non-transportation stuff. So these are things like urban heat island effect, how it is that urban design creates the possibility for sustainability in architecture, things like solar orientation, wind orientation, things like that. And then also embodied energy, so different from the transportation land use side. And the last one is equity and health, where we're thinking about things like affordability, accessibility, physical activity, safety, and then social mobility. The way that the built environment is really helping people or helping or hurting people's ability to get themselves out of or improving their socioeconomic situation. So if you look at these as these main outcome goals, the things we're trying to get to when we think about sustainability and the built environment and urban design, the next step is really saying, well, in urban design, we work at these different types of scales. There's the region and city, which is large kind of metropolitan footprints, district and neighborhood, straightforward, and then block and street and project parcel. Those are similar scales. Block and street is typically what we think of that happens in the public realm, and project parcel is typically what we think of in the private realm, right? So inside of parcels. That's not always true, obviously. There's some examples where projects mix those things, but that's generally the types of things that we're thinking about. So with this, then what we've done is we've organized over 50 specific physical, we call urban design elements, physical things that you can do in the city around this outcome goals and these scales. I think, yeah, here we go. So I just put a link in the chat, which if you go to that, you can download the actual framework. You don't have to try to read all this here. But so what this does is it gives you like it's really a tool to help you understand how it is you can work on projects. So for instance, if you have a project at a specific scale, this gives you an idea of all the questions you should be asking in that project, right? It gives you almost like a design guide or a sense of what kinds of things you should be dealing with. You can also think about it in terms of outcome goals. If we really want a specific outcome goal, right? Here's all the different things that need to happen at the different scales to get to that outcome goal. So you can use this, for instance, as a design tool. You can use it as a stakeholder engagement tool. Stakeholders typically know this part really well, and this is kind of helps them interpret what exactly needs to happen in the built environment to get to that. You can use it as an evaluation tool. I'll talk a little bit more about those things later. So this is the basic structure of the framework. So here we go. So I'm going to go through fairly quickly some of these different pieces just to give you a sense of how it's organized. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover a ton of this, but hopefully give you a sense of how it works. So this first row, the energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use, as I mentioned, is really trying to get people out of cars and into bike ped transit. So what are the things that need to happen? Well, at the largest, the region, city scale, we're talking about things like compact development. Here on the right-hand side, you see Portland's urban growth boundary. Right, compact development helps a ton because it gives you density and proximity, which I think we're all familiar with. We're also at the scale thinking about the transit networks, the large-scale cycling networks over the entire metropolitan area, how we have balanced vehicular networks that we're not letting cars dominate, but then also the regional land use mix at this scale. So how is it that the distribution of uses across the entire region is evenly balanced. So we don't have all of our industrial in one area, all of our residential in one area, all of our commercial in one area, right? So those are the types of things that we're thinking about at that largest scale. At the district and neighborhood scale, we're really starting to talk a lot more about how it is that our blocks and streets are organized. So this on the left is Portland. I'm sure many of you are familiar, 200 by 200 foot grids, versus what's typically what we call loops and lollipops kind of development. And you can see the difference in connectivity that happens because of this, right? So if I'm here and want to go up to over here, I can pretty much walk a fairly straight line distance to get to that thing, right? In this situation, if I live here and I want to go up to here, the network distance I need to travel is much, much longer. I come out here, who knows what kind of road I need to go on there, back there and down. And that, oftentimes doubles or triples the distance that you need to walk. So that creates all sorts of problems. And we do, obvious things and tell people like, well, let's just get in the car. I'll just drive there. So this idea of connectivity, street connectivity really matters a ton at this scale. We can also think at this scale about our zoning and platting, high density zoning and platting. On the one hand, the zoning is, allows this to be high density and this not, but also the platting, the size of the lots, right? It's very difficult to get this type of a building happening in these locations because of smaller lots generally. We can also think about our district parking approaches, right? So thinking about how much parking we're requiring and if we're allowing strategies like district parking. And then finally, the land use mix at this smaller scale. So this is, the 15, 20-minute neighborhood idea that could be happening here. This is obviously mixed use downtown. There's lots of everything you might need, or most everything you might need can be in walking or biking distance here. Single use zoning, segregated kind of zoning, absolutely. That creates a problem where we have to move out around a whole lot more larger distances and then pushes us towards the car. In terms of the block and street, a ton of stuff that we can be doing to create multimodal street design. This is an image from NACTO's Urban Street Design Guide, which is a fantastic resource. So I highly recommend it if you're not familiar with it. But it's everything from making sure that pedestrians have ample space, ample sidewalks, really clearly marked crossings, pedestrian areas of refuge, all these types of things. Bicycles have their a space where they're allowed to go on and are not impacted by traffic. So this is a separated bikeway here. Transit has, where possible, its own dedicated lanes and great, wonderful transit facilities, ease of movement, and that cars are allowed, but they're not allowed to dominate. So they're part of this whole scene, but they're not allowed to, impinge on the other kind of modes that could be working on. So all sorts of things that can make that happen. We also think about parking in this part more, not just the amount of parking we have, but really thinking about the parking design. So things like the scale. Is parking on the corner or not? Do we put the building in front on the street side of the parking? How big are our curb cuts that we have along that? What's the edge condition of the parking lot design, right? So we're really thinking about design of the parking at this scale. And then finally, at the project and parcel scale, a whole lot of this really has to do with what we call active street edges. How much is the building really contributing to the pedestrian cycling environment on the street? So these are examples. This is a residential example here on the left where you see, it's a high density building, a high rise building over here, and with podium around it. But instead of having this podium just have one entrance where all the circulation is internal, this all has individual entrances. These are townhomes with individual entrances directly onto the street. And so what this creates is this fantastic, activity on the street, this great semi-private, semi-public zone where there's interaction that can happen. And even when there's nobody on the street, it feels like there's eyes on the street, and this feels safe, right? This is an example in like kind of a commercial area, similar kind of idea. And the example I always like to say is, imagine this as everything completely the same, except for that this is a continuous brick wall, right? And how much that changes, how much the architecture at this project and parcel scale is really contributing through transparency, through multiple entrances to this really like vibrant public realm, pedestrian friendly kind of area. Okay, so that's energy use and greenhouse gas transportation and land use. I'm going to again quickly go through some of these other topics. So talking about water, there's really these two strategies that we think about with water. One, minimize the amount of runoff that you have, try to have less water moving horizontally, and two, mitigate where runoff does happen. This is a slide that kind of shows the difference of the impacts of development. Here you see in an undeveloped area, when rain falls, 25% goes deep into the ground, 25 shallow, 10% becomes runoff. The rest of it is evapotranspirated. In developed areas where there's a lot of impervious surface, only 5 goes into deep infiltration, 10 to shallow infiltration. So this is huge problems with refilling aquifers. But then 55% is runoff, more than 5 times the amount of runoff that we have in a natural system, right? And so how do we deal with this? This creates all sorts of problems in that the runoff is typically a large volume, hot, picks up pollutants, creates erosion, right? All sorts of issues. So ways that we can minimize the amount of runoff. Well, first one, looking at region and city scale is really compact development. Instead of developing along this entire watershed here evenly everywhere, where you're impacting the entire water system everywhere negatively, concentrate your development in one area and let the rest of the watershed be actually a bit more in its natural state. So we're reducing the amount of roads that exist here, impervious surfaces, pollutants that we're bringing out into these areas. So absolutely a great compact development, is a fantastic tool for all different parts of sustainability. We can also do things like, at the block and street scale, reducing the amount of impervious surface that we have. So thinner streets or some permeable paving can happen in these areas. And then also the use at the block, street, and project parcel scale of trees, right? Urban street trees do a fantastic amount of holding water before it ever touches the ground. You can see here after a storm how this area is completely dry, all held based on the kind of canopy that you have, the branching structure, the bark structure, all these types of things. If you do all these things and you're minimizing the amount of runoff that's being created, in other words, the amount of water that's hitting the ground and moving horizontally, well, once it does, the part that you can't mitigate or the part that you can't reduce, how do you mitigate those things? And this is, this whole system of green stormwater infrastructure and robust stormwater networks that we have, everything from detention retention ponds to rain gardens to bioswales, which let water, instead of it putting into pipe and moving it quickly out into a river or a lake or something like that. We have this really different approach, which is to cool water off, slow it down, filter it, and put it back into natural systems, right? So that all these things, instead of like just getting water into a pipe and out into the middle of nowhere in natural systems, this is always trying to slow it down, filter it, let it cool off, and then put it back into the ground itself or into natural systems. Part of this whole strategy as well of mitigation is actually trees again, because as they pull water out of the ground, put it up into their leaves or needles, and put it out into the atmosphere, they're actually creating more opportunity for water to come into the ground. So this really has a really great effect in reducing the impacts of runoff and stormwater. In terms of ecology and habitat, that third row there, really a bunch of different strategies. Make sure you don't disturb things you shouldn't disturb, any critical habitat, mitigate where you do touch it, and then create microhabitats. Some ways that you do this. Well, first is trying to create these fantastic, robust ecological networks, letting species move freely between areas and have the habitat that they need. Oftentimes, you don't think of urban areas as places where we should be thinking about habitat. There's a ton of opportunities for that. It actually absolutely is a place that we should be thinking about habitat. So this is a really good example of, these ecological corridors that you can see that happen through here, which let animal species, of all types move all the way through these things, much more diversity of habitat, diversity of gene pools, all these types of things. So you see these all over the place in cities. You'll see that sometimes what happens, though, is that there's infrastructure that goes through these areas. So how do we deal with these wildlife crossings, right? This is at the block and street scale. Well, there's a ton of strategies for dealing with that. Creating culverts, which are designed, this one specifically for turtles in Maine, or larger ones for larger mammals, or the most robust one possible. This is a land bridge, the Tobin Land Bridge in Texas, where you actually create this fantastic connection between different habitats across, a fast-moving freeway, which would never allow all sorts of species, be it larger animals or smaller animals, to cross easily, right? So these are all ways that we can help create that robust ecological network, let species move easily from one place to another. Thinking about different types of habitat that we can do this in, either core habitat or edge habitat, and different types of connections from stepping stones to corridors and such. Thinking about things in terms of how much we need to buffer certain areas. So this is here in block and street, robust ecological area buffers. So if we have development next to critical habitat, how much space do we need? How do we create that space between these areas so that you don't have impact, right? There's lots of fantastic resources to show you how to do that. And I'll talk in a bit about the book, which kind of gives all more information about each one of these topics. Another topic is which we talk to a lot of ecologists and biologists about. What is it urban designers should think about in urban areas to help with ecology? A point that came up repeatedly was this question of vertical complexity. So instead of having things that are, simply lawn and these trees without a whole lot of structure, really thinking much more about the way that our natural forests and work with this whole range of different structures of tall trees, smaller trees, all this different canopies, bushes, shrubs, sedges, ground cover, all working to create this range of different structures, different habitats for different species. And, we can do that in urban areas without too much of a problem. This is, for instance, a swale off of a parking lot, which is helping collect the rainwater. But instead of just having that be a grassy ditch, you really showing opportunities to create more vertical complexity, which is fantastic for what most any ecologist will tell you is the most important species type in the ecological whole network, which is in cities, which is insects, making sure that insects thrive. If insects thrive, you can have everything else thrive. Opportunities to create microhabitat, right? Places that help create robust habitat within areas. We work as urban designers in large enough scales that we can do these types of things as well. Okay, 2 more to go. Energy use and production. This is, again, the question of not thinking about the transportation side, but how it is that that the built environment is really impacting energy use overall outside of transportation. So obviously this changes a whole lot depending on the climates. These are a bunch of the climates that we look at in the book. And to give you an example of the types of things that we look at, for instance, here we think about different building typologies, right? And how they might work better or worse in different climatic zones, right? So you can think to yourself as an urban designer, what zone am I in? What kind of zone am I in? What makes the most sense in terms of typologies? Well, then how do I make sure with zoning and with platting and with solar orientation, right? The solar orientation of blocks that I really take the most advantage of these types of things. We can also think about with energy use and production, things like the color of the environment. We know about the albedo effect, which darker colors end up absorbing heat much more. This is an example in Barcelona where they've really literally greened the entire sidewalk. And then finally, with energy use and production, we can think about how it is the built environment itself impacts the embodied energy, how much energy it took to make and to maintain an urban area. So these are examples of varying density here from Florida all the way to New York here. And just think about how much the infrastructure that we have here, the energy that went to put together, the street, so the road itself, the roadway, the water infrastructure, electrical lines, all these things, how much of that is needed for a block in New York City? How many units are being served by this versus a block in the suburban area, right? And how many units are being served with that, right? Tons more energy use in the embodied energy of the city for a much smaller population that's being served by that. Okay. Finally, with equity and health, as I mentioned, we're really looking at these different areas. Affordability, how is it that urban design is affecting affordability? Everything from all the stuff that we talked about, and I'll say with accessibility as well, all the things that we talked about with transportation in terms of energy use, well, that also has to do with accessibility as well. It turns out that the car is an expensive way of moving around, and that if we can have bike, ped, and transit be easier to use, it's actually fantastic for affordability and for accessibility. For affordability, we can also think about things of the mix of housing unit types that we're having. Lots of research has shown that the higher the mix of unit types, the lower the cost of rents overall, those types of things. In terms of physical activity, we're talking about are there parks nearby? And if there are, what types of amenities do they have? For what age groups, right? For older adults, for young kids, how do we make sure that we do that? Tons of research shows that one of the biggest indicators of will you do exercise today is how easy it is for you to get to a place to do that exercise. So really important with that. With safety, we're talking about things like the limited point source pollution, limited location of point source pollution. So making sure, for instance, that we don't have schools right next to freeways, right? Or thinking about industrial areas that create pollutants being near residential areas, those types of things. For those of you in Portland, the red eye, I think it was called a red eye glass factory, was a really big issue a couple of years back. We can also think about safety from crashes, so all the transportation related stuff, and we also think about issues of how we create environments that help create more feelings of safety. And finally, social mobility. Lots of parts of how we create the built environment really affect people's ability to improve their socioeconomic situation. So how easy is it for me to get to my job, to services, to healthcare, to school, to education, all these types of things, big impact on that. How affordable is it? Do I have funding to improve my economic situation? Do I have enough so I can invest in that? Those types of things. Okay. All right, that was a lot to go through, but hopefully it gives you a rough idea of the types of things that we cover in the framework. As I mentioned before, you can use the framework on the one hand to kind of think about what your outcome goal is that you're interested in, and then all the pieces, physical design pieces that plug into that. I call this often like this magic decoder ring that helps, especially stakeholders, community stakeholders, understand if they want this, these are the things that need to happen. Whoops, sorry. On the other hand, you can talk, as I mentioned, you can think about having a project at a specific scale. These are all the pieces that you can be asking about, that you should be thinking about as you do the project. That you should be asking if you can actually address those things. The framework also helps you understand synergies and co-benefits. So, for instance, example I like to talk about, this is Ramblas in Poblenou, the Poblenou Ramblas in Barcelona. And if you think about, for instance, how it is we think of trees, where typically many of us who've decided what trees are going to go in a certain project, oftentimes we're going by what happened in a recent project or whatever a city's recommended species are, and we typically go 20, 30 feet on center for a tree. Well, you can actually think about this much more robustly, looking at all these outcome goals that you want, right? You can think about, well, how is the tree, how do I position it in a way that helps buffer between a pedestrian area and a vehicular area? Or how does it help create a really wonderful pedestrian environment? In terms of stormwater, we can think of what species we're choosing and what their canopy structure is and the extent of that canopy for stopping water from ever touching the ground. In terms of ecology and habitat, maybe we should be thinking about that these trees should not actually be 20 foot on center or 30 foot on center, but instead they should be clustered, and that maybe we shouldn't have a single species, but we should have a range of different species. And maybe that we should have more vertical complexity at the base of these trees, right? In terms of energy use and production, we can think about where these trees are located and how much shade they're producing. Are they helping shade a building? Are they on the south side or east or west side? Are they helping to shield from a wind? And in terms of equity and health, we can think about things like what kind of species are we using? Are there allergens that are created by this? So again, you can use this framework to help make more sophisticated decisions and help understand synergies across things. So I'll just end with a couple more slides here. You can use this as a design tool. As I mentioned, you can do evaluation using this framework of both existing conditions and potential scenarios, stakeholder engagement, and then you can also use it to figure out what your design team composition. We've worked with Gail's office a couple of years back, looking at a bunch of their different offices and looking at having everyone in the office fill out the framework in terms of, is this something I know a lot about, this element? Is it something I'm not sure, know a little bit about, and something I don't know anything about? You can quickly kind of get a landscape of how it is that the expertise that you have, how you might be able to create teams, what your next hire might be. I'm going to skip this. This is just how we've used it in a project. I'm going to skip that real quick and just talk about the book itself. So the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook took about 10 years to create. The framework created about that was like 14, 15 years ago. And the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook was just published in April, and we're super excited to have that out. And the way it structures it basically takes the framework, and then each element in the framework has its own chapter. And I'm going to show you what one of those chapters looks like. So this is robust ecological area buffers. So each chapter has what we call this dashboard page, which gives you a sense of what the topic is, a brief description if you've never heard of this topic before, a little idea of what the metrics of it are associated with this. This section here talks about how it relates to urban other elements. So it talks about how this element is influenced by certain elements in a sentence or two that describes why it is, and how it is that this element influences other urban design elements. So you can start to understand the relationships between these pieces. Implementation talks about in greenfield and retrofits, how much it costs or the political capital you really need to make this happen. So relative to some of the other elements. Each of these chapters, then again, each element has its own chapter, has a recommended approach. This is what we're trying to get to, typical approach. This is often the stuff that we build, which is not so great. Why it's important, and this is where we have the kind of peer-reviewed journal information about this, of what you're trying to get to, what the outcome, how this affects the outcome that you want. Some background information for those of you who don't know a whole lot about ecological areas, understanding the difference between core and edge habitat, where it is you might buffer, and some different issues that might impact the characteristics of your buffer. We have a section on considerations and caveats, and this is really trying to get you to be just a little bit more sophisticated about this topic. So understanding how it interacts with other elements a little bit more, political issues you might run into around this, maintenance and operation issues you might run into around this, and some other issues. And then finally, this design guides, right? So these are guidelines for urban design, where we've distilled a ton of the information, this kind of cutting edge research best practices, and given just basic ideas of the types of things that you should be doing. So this really gives you some rules of thumb, some guides about how best to make decisions so that you don't create problems later on. So that's the book. A whole lot of people helped make this work possible. Some of you, I think, are actually on this call. Professionals in the field, in a bunch of different fields, students, former students, and professors who've helped with this. So huge thanks, Kaarin. I give tons of thanks for all the people who've helped us understand all these different topics. Yeah, so books available if you're interested. And I'll say as well that I'm really interested in having people working with a framework and you applying it to projects. So I've started a small urban design consulting firm, Element Urban Design. If there's interest, I would love to be helping you with those types of things. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kaarin, and happy to take questions afterwards.
Thanks, Nico. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share some slides and some thoughts pretty quickly, including like a 10-second view window inside of this book. Because if we were together in person, we could show you this work and hand around a copy in the room, and you could sort of get a sense of what is in these 450 pages of research, including a really stupendous glossary, I have to say. As an architect trained as a journalist, I really appreciate a lot of the different information that we put together to share this work. But one of the driving things to take away is this really comes back to a deep belief that cities are places for both urgency and optimism in our work related to sustainability. I think all of you here in this room and in this call together understand and believe that and practice that every day in your work. I'm really fortunate to have had the opportunity in my local community to have worked at a lot of different scales over this last 25 years. And also in a lot of different ways, from practice in a generalist and traditional architectural practice, doing a lot of work with communities and sort of intensive community engagement work, doing public interest work and housing advocacy work, and then also teaching. And one of the things that Nico was speaking to that we're trying to address with this book is that as you're digging into any place, and as students, specialized professionals working in integrated teams, but especially people who are new to this work and don't have 25 or 30 years of specific project experience behind them, the work of urban design can be somewhat overwhelming. Understanding how to enter a project, what the influence you might have depending on the scale that you are coming to a project through, right? The extent of the reach that you have, it can be overwhelming. And our hope with this work is that by building on the research of this last many years that Nico mentioned, that we would be able to help people overcome that sense of it being too overwhelming and the questions or the opportunities and the possibility to engage feeling too large, and that it wasn't maybe something that would be appropriate to engage with a project. In many cases, this comes back to the fact that we have to do some things differently. We have to do a lot of things differently. And that for professionals who are advising others on how to approach the world and our work and wanting to be both sensitive and empathetic to the environments that we are in, there's of course a really deep understanding of context and that response to context, but also that there's a lot that we need to do differently. And just capturing that within your mind and bringing that to every project, I think is one of the keys to applying this work. So Nico talked a bit about how to use this book, how we organized it, how it was designed, that in and of itself to translate the work of the framework into a reference that was multidimensional and also applying spatially to the world was challenging. Fun to also include Easter eggs like pictures of former students' hands in photographs within this book. But we're hoping that for people who are wanting to use this as a resource, that as Nico described and this graphic shows, that there is a lot of dense information presented in a way that is accessible to people, that makes the questions that are being asked, that makes the complexity of the problems or the opportunities accessible, that we would actually be able to present this in a way that could help people see the interconnectedness of our concerns. In this work, we're talking about understanding the opportunity of sustainability and improvement within our cities, building more livable, more sociable, more equitable places across the built networks of our environments, but also across the natural systems and the natural networks that exist within cities. And so to show you some of that here, and I want to be sure I'm not making that whole side of my screen invisible. Hopefully you can see everything that I can see on my screen.
It all looks good. It all looks good.
Oh, good. Thank you, Nico. So in the case of understanding these chapters and how the book is laid out, one hope that we have is that it's really easy for people to see the connection between something like being concerned about a robust urban forest in your city, that also connects to concerns you might have about ecological corridors and patches of functional ecology and habitat within your city, that also connects directly to urban microclimates and how it is that we can be naturally cooling the cities that we are living in and providing more sustainable places and places where literally human lives are not going to be at risk due entirely to urban heat island. But that also all of those choices related in many cases to the natural networks and systems within our cities support human behavior and support the built environment, things like pedestrian-oriented streets and bicycle-friendly streets, that of course something like an urban forest canopy that is connected and extensive across the city is going to support. And all of that relates to an activation of our street spaces and public realm that's really delightful. Another way to think about this, and throughout the book, we worked very hard to present something that would be graphically instructive and accessible to people, because so much of the science behind this research is quite dense. But in the case of understanding, say, robust ecological networks, that you need to understand the components of that work, but also the core areas, stepping stone habitat, linear corridors. And if you're thinking about not a network of work, you're thinking about, say, an ecological area buffer, that you also understand the functions of those buffers and that there are specific functions that ecological buffers provide. And that when you're thinking about those kinds of spaces within a city, that the vertical complexity you can include within those same areas can be as influential as expanding the area of green space or open space that you're working with. And that is also an ecological opportunity that is present every time that you're thinking about something that might seem a much more urban or built intervention, like the design of a street or a transportation corridor, or a network of connectivity that has the opportunity to be both activated and more ecological in its performance. The last piece I just want to share is that thinking about the work that we all do professionally, the challenge of this work right now, but always, is that in every project, we have to both express and connect to values and navigate and manage conflicts. And there's a lot of opportunity that we've seen, and that I've had the opportunity to work with some wonderful colleagues and professionals on how a more intensive urban design response might influence architecture at the site scale. Also, that there are ways in which understanding this work and applying it through intensive redevelopment processes to help communities understand decisions like investing in stormwater infrastructure versus sidewalk connectivity versus alley structure or block structure. These are all really important decisions that community members are having to make, but if they don't understand how those built decisions connect to their values, it's much more difficult for them to feel as though their engagement was purposeful and meaningful. And so we're hoping that this book can help people with that. Lastly, I will just offer and take this as a metaphor of our times. You could think about something like the green infrastructure and the network that sits in this image on the left and the extent of it, and see that highway crossing and think, how unfortunate that decisions made a generation or two before the one that we are now practicing within decided to sever the connectivity of this natural system. And isn't that a terrible circumstance that these things are forever separated and we'll never be able to reconnect them? When in fact, through thoughtful design intervention at different scales, it's not always a massive wildlife corridor bridge in an area of incredibly sensitive and important habitat, but sometimes it's just knitting back connections at a finer grain and a smaller scale. And that as we know how to do that in our community with all sorts of different projects, we will be better. I will be applying this work, am applying this work in my responsibility now as the mayor of Eugene. I hope you also will find ways to apply this work and you're thinking about Portland and the larger metro area. And with that, I will just say we're happy to answer questions, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Nico and Kaarin. I'm a huge fan of the book, and just a note, I was equally just impressed by the content and the format, where I think that it really leverages the format of a book. And managing this information, I imagine this on just perched on a desk, tattered and used so frequently. It just is an incredible wealth of information. Not just the content also, but it's also lays out this strategy to make a roadmap to navigate this matrix for such relevant projects. So thank you so much. It really is a critical tool.
I have to say that is so great to hear, because the difficulty of doing a lot of this work is that there's just such a volume of it, and there's so many pieces, and a lot of the work that Kaarin and I really like, you scratch your head a whole lot, is like, how do you just distill this down to something that, one, just get to the core part of it, and two, communicate in a way that's easy to access. And so a whole lot of focus was really that, the easy to understand, easy to navigate, and that someone who's a professional, like I'm assuming most of the people who are on this call, but also like a community stakeholder could pick this up and be like, oh yeah, that right. And I think, tying back to something that Kaarin was just saying, having people really feel that they've got agency on how it is they can affect the built environment is just critically important. That's like one of the main things that we want them to do. Like, don't be overwhelmed by this. Don't think like, oh my God, this is too complicated. It's not something I can deal with. But like chipping away and figuring out how you can address all these things.
I think it removes the feeling of not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yay!
Just such a relief. Anyway,
it's easy. It was very easy to imagine. I think about this, all of your offices, there's a giant bookcase somewhere that's holding a whole bunch of 3-inch wide books, and they're useful, but they're not references when you're trying to work early in a design process. And they're not references that you might go back to and think, oh, I'd like to learn a little bit something more about this, or even understand, like, what is that thing that that member of my consultant team was so concerned about that I've never really even considered to be relevant. As a profession, it's sometimes challenging for us, licensed and responsible as generalists, often as architects, but also as landscape architects, to be really deep into our own universe. But sometimes that makes it harder to carry the concerns and the constraints of our professional partners. And one hope with this resource and in putting together this book is that it just makes it easier for people to have better orientation to the challenges that each of us are facing and our responsibilities as professionals, but also more ideas about where the bridges and the real levers for design might be. In that way, I think it could be really, really helpful.
There are a couple questions already posted, and feel free to add to the chat. We have about 10 minutes of discussion. I know this is just the first layer of the onion peel, and I love that you basically summarize the entire book on that one page, which is super helpful. Let's see, or feel free to raise your hand as well. But I imagine it's such a like efficient format. I imagine there's a lot that you had to leave behind. There's a question, what are some of those items that you had to leave behind that you would have liked to have included?
I'll say so. This is a good question in that at some point you're like, you can't let the great get in the way of the good. There's a whole lot of really helpful things out there we're putting out, and I'll tell you, there's already like a file with the next edition with the things that we should be thinking about. One of the ones that actually dropped out just literally out of like room and time was district energy, which I think is one that in the next iteration, my hope is that we bring it back in. But that is like one of the pieces that came out. And the other things that came out were really not necessarily specific elements, but just trying to distill it down. And this is like where we really look forward to hearing feedback from people about this. Distilling things down to a level that it's helpful, but not so much information that it becomes overwhelming and then like really isn't helpful anymore. I think, what Kaarin was just saying of, having your bookcase with all this information, right? And we have the internet. I mean, we have like information is not our problem. Our problem is like, how do we organize it, understand it, and take action with it? And so a lot of the painful pieces were like, okay, we got to simplify this a little bit more. And we're going to take out these pieces and like this is good enough to make good, what I think of as good schematic design or design development decisions, right? And then, yes, you're going to need more expertise to go to the next piece.
There was a delightful moment when working on the research for some of the sections, the ecology and habitat super section of the book, some of those chapters, where one of the papers I was reading was describing the challenge within the deep scientific community of even communicating within that community, because the language is so specific and so meaningful when you're trying to do science at that level. And we were trying to connect to like, how can this be relevant to architects, urban designers, landscape architects, transportation planners, community members, right? How can we bring it up to that level? And it is, the language alone is challenging because, and I would say one of the things that I hope is really helpful with this book as a resource is that it allows for people to be more familiar with the specificity of certain language as partners in a design process, because you might think that a buffer and a corridor are the same thing. Or a conservation buffer and a conservation corridor and a habitat corridor are the same thing. And they may not be. They might not even be close. Like they could be literally miles different in size. So for urban design projects, that's incredibly important, right? To know what you're really talking about, and also important for helping your community's engagement to be more relevant to the design problem at hand. I did also see Michael's question in the chat about housing cost and if it's addressed and in which topic area is it addressed. And what I would say is that affordable housing strategies is a specific chapter within the book, as is a mix of housing types, 2 different chapters focused on those 2 issues. But across several chapters within the book, from the first chapter, first section, compact development, all the way through equity and health and the equitable distribution of uses and services within cities, those all speak to the affordability of housing. And within each chapter that is relevant to housing supply, to housing production, housing typologies, and our development pattern related to residential uses, there are reference points that speak to decisions that might typically increase or decrease the total cost of living and the cost of housing that a person is experiencing.
Yeah, I'll add, infill housing is also one that looks at those topics, and as Kaarin said, it's kind of scattered all through this. One of the things that we like focus on as well is that when we talk about affordability, is that it's not housing's the one that we are typically very aware of because we pay monthly for that, and there's one check. But transportation, it's often a similar burden, but it's hidden because the amount you had to pay for your car or your insurance happens, or maintenance happens once every 2 years if you're 3 years if you're lucky. Right. So really understanding the two parts of affordability that are really big are both the housing piece and the transportation piece.
And I think that what you were saying before, Kaarin, about the language of the scientific aspects of the book, that this also starts to present how these spheres of design, policy, science, and economics start to influence one another.
Planning.
Planning, yes.
Emerging.
And it depending on how you practice, you may not necessarily touch on those elements, but to understand the complex ecosystem of implementing or carrying out or connecting a design process, but being just aware of those different spheres, I think is a great also format of the book itself.
Yeah. So I alluded to this briefly, but we mentioned one of the chapters within the book is high vertical complexity, and it relates to microhabitat, urban microhabitat. And one of the things I think that is interesting, and this is one of the citations included in that chapter, is that you look around at a lot of our urban environments and green spaces, and there's not a lot of complexity vertically within those environments. There are a lot of places that are just grass, right? Because it's our sod. It's a very functional, multi-purpose surface, but not a lot of shrubs, right? There's issues sometimes with shrubbery and feeling like, maybe there's not sight lines that might be desirable, maybe not trees that are intended to grow to be large shade canopy trees or diversity of trees because of infrastructure or other elements, power lines that might be within certain places. And one of the pieces of information that I think is really interesting is that when we're looking at our cities and a community member or a conversation might turn to something like concern for urban biodiversity, a concern for urban habitat, that you can think about that, of course, through the area and extent of your green space and your open space networks, and really wanting for those to be as robust and expansive as possible. But within constrained spaces, the opportunity to increase the vertical complexity within vegetated areas can offer as much of a boost to biodiversity as doubling the existing space of a really low performing vegetated environment or more, right? That's like a generous version to say it only doubles, because that does so much more for providing for a diversity of species, all the wonderful things that happen when different things come together in one place. And that's not really how we talk about it very much. And it brings it back to the specificity of particular design projects and their opportunities, to the circumstance and context that particular opportunities exist within, and then not getting stuck in one piece of messaging related to what sustainability looks like, but really getting to engage the whole delight of sustainability.
Thank you. Hadley had a question of how does the book translate to in design in lower density cities such as Eugene?
Oh gosh, wonderfully. It's interesting. We had a webinar with our Pacific Rim universities, research institutions several months ago. And in some of those cases, talking with practitioners who are in much more consolidated urban form, much, much denser, built full, so to speak, cities, and the questions about how to reintegrate sustainability when there are no empty squares. Medium-sized cities, especially, the United States, we are full of them. We are full of opportunities. Small cities, smaller communities, depending on when they first grew and the patterns of development that are now driving their continued change, I see as fantastic opportunities for the integration of more sustainable design practices, principles, and outcomes. Because in a lot of cases, there is an empty square. There's huge expanses of, so the example of Eugene, huge expanses of surface parking lots, right? Corridors that were developed before there were street standards for trees, or for bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure. All cities in the United States are dealing with the transformation of what was once a highway passing through a city or near a city into a boulevard condition, now completely subsumed by that urban area. All of those opportunities are ripe for this kind of integrated thinking. I think the biggest challenge is the feasibility and actually making those projects happen. But when I talk with my first year graduate planning students, and we do projects that are difficult corridor retrofit reimaginings, or previously urbanized, big box store sites that are now identified, as a new district for development or for climate friendly area, I just try to remind them, like, this is going to be what you're working on for the rest of your professional career, because we really need for these spaces to be higher performing in our cities, and just offering more contribution, more life, more turning the wheel, so to speak, in terms of what is being offered and then fed back into that system.
And if I could add a little bit to that, I love that question, because I get this a lot of, like, well, not everyone is like, a dense downtown core and, mixed use, multimodal, and that is almost exactly one of the reasons that we organize this like this, right? So the idea of the framework is, here's a lot of the things that you should, the landscape of things that you should be thinking about. But if you're doing, a single family neighborhood somewhere, there's a lot of things that you can be doing as well. So this is not based on models of development. These are based on elements. So within whatever project you have, you're doing, as I said, you're doing a single family development in Florida, suburban Florida, there's a ton of stuff that you can be doing, right? Thinking about, connectivity between these things, your block structure, your lot sizes, stormwater issues around there, bike infrastructure that happens around there. Are you able to, is there any mixed use that might be somewhat nearby, right? All these types of things. So the idea is really that this is not prescriptive. It's not a model. It's not, there's this, we have to have everything look like Copenhagen. Instead, it's saying, well, here's a bunch of different topics that you can be applying to any project that you're working on, regardless of those types of morphological kind of issues.
Thank you so much. I think we're at time, and I think we're just scratching the surface. I'm happy to hear that there's some plans for another edition. So, which I look forward to, because this is just a framework that can just host such a wealth of information. So, Kaarin, Nico, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining today, and your questions.
Thank you all for hosting us. Super appreciate it, and please feel free to reach out if anyone has any questions.
Before we go, note that in the chat you can get a planning CEU credit for today's presentation. Kathy and everyone's worked really hard to get that into our presentations, both AIA. Today was an AICP credit. There it is in the chat. So we're trying to hit it from all angles. Kaarin, Nico, thank you so much for presenting all this. Think Be Friendly Cities, everyone. I'll throw that in as a follow-up to a lot of your great points. Go buy that book. And look forward next month. We'll have another UDP presentation coming up. We're working on topics all the way out to May, so we're always looking for suggestions. Again, Nico and Kaarin, thanks so much for giving your time today.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Annie. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.